The citizens and denizens of Hyrule are certainly a diverse lot, with each group having expertly adapted to the environment they've been presented with. We have the mountain-dwelling Goron, the Zora occupying the lakes and rivers, Gerudo ruling the desert, and the Kokiri and Korok hidden deep in the forest. Honestly, the only way left to look is up, and indeed, the skies bear the fruit of civilization as well. No, not those eldritch monstrosities. I'm talking about a graceful bird people, who once dwelled in the ocean but beat the odds, grew feathers, and took to the skies. In this episode of Hyrule History, we talk about the fantastic birdmen, the favored people of Valu. Today, we're talking about the Rito. No, not that Rito. This Rito. To understand the history of the Rito, first we need to take a quick detour through the history of the Zora. The Zora are one of Hyrule's oldest and most long-lived races, likely having evolved from the Perella. We have evidence of the existence of the Zora as far back in the timeline as Minish Cap, where Zora flippers can be found. We then meet the Zora proper in Ocarina of Time, where they're a civilized race in Hyrule, dealing with Ganondorf's wrath and doing their best to survive despite the troubles befallen them. They play an important role in the Hero of Time's quest. When the events of Ocarina unfold and the three timelines are created, what happens to the Zora differs pretty drastically depending on the timeline. In the Decline timeline, Zora for the most part become river-dwelling, beastly, hostile creatures, at least as far as Hyrule is concerned. Other lands still contain civilizations of Zora, and not all of these river Zora are evil, but by the end of the timeline, the Zora too seem to be in decline, eventually becoming little more than mindless monsters for Link to kill. The Child timeline sees some propagation of mindless river Zora, especially near the end, but Zora as a civilization continues as well, with a proper Zora kingdom being very much present in the ages of Twilight Princess. However, for the purpose of giving context to the Rito, it's the adult timeline we're most concerned with. In the adult timeline, a victorious Link is sent back through time to enjoy the childhood that was robbed from him due to the time skip. However, the Hyrule he left behind didn't stop existing. Instead, it went on without him, and as a result of his absence, when Ganondorf came back, there was no Link to stop him. In a last-ditch attempt to save the people of Hyrule, the gods responded by flooding the lands, trapping Ganondorf's evil underneath the waves. What races could survive did so by fleeing to mountaintops. Not all races were designed to live atop a mountain, and over time, those that survived had to evolve. One of these people were the Zora. At first glance, it would seem odd that the Zora were unable to survive the flood. A massive flood of water should, if anything, be beneficial for the water-dwelling people. However, a combination of things kept this from being true, and the Zora were unable to adapt to the flood. Instead, they were forced to flee up the mountains like all the other races, and, as a result, the Zora began the slow process of evolution. They became a more human-like people, losing their scales for skin. At some unspecified point of time, the dragon Valu landed on the mountain. The evolved Zora began worshipping him, and the island soon became known as Dragon Roost Island. They formed a symbiotic relationship with Valu. The great dragon protected them, and, more importantly, the dragon gave them scales. These dragon scales were magical and caused further transformation, giving the people once known as Zora the ability of flight. Over time, the Zora turned into wholly new people, scales turning to skin, and fins turning to feathers. Large beaks grew in replacement of noses. It didn't even make sense to call them Zora anymore. They now went by a new name, the Rito. The Rito would play a pretty big role in the future of the Great Sea, specifically in the life of the Hero of Winds. In fact, it was thanks to the Rito that the Hero of Winds left his tiny island to begin with. Quill was a rather average Rito, with a bit of a heroic streak to him. He arrived on Outset Island on Link's birthday to deliver mail, as is his job. Unfortunately, or indeed fortunately for Link, he chose a pretty rotten birthday to arrive on. Link's sister Aryll kidnapped by the Helmarok King, Tetra refusing to bring Link aboard her pirate ship. It's a sticky situation. It's Quill who steps up, scolding Tetra and reminding her that she owes Link 2 favors. Not only did Link save her, but the Helmarok King had been snatching girls with long ears and mistaked Aryll for Tetra. Tetra relents and brings Link to Forsaken Fortress. Link was no doubt thankful to Quill, but this wouldn't be the last time that the Rito would have an impact on his life. After failing to retrieve his sister, Link then learns that saving her is likely to mean a run-in with Ganondorf, who can only be defeated with the Master Sword, which can only be accomplished by raising the Tower of the Gods, which can only be accomplished by collecting the 3 Goddess Pearls. That's a lot of things. One of these pearls happens to be in the hands of a familiar bird people, the Rito. Link's first stop brought him to the home of the great dragon Valu, Dragon Roost Island. As Link quickly discovered, this is also the home of the Rito. He meets Quill once again and quickly learned of trouble facing the Rito. Valu had become violent and angry, throwing non-stop tantrums. This began to threaten the Rito's very way of life, as the tantrums had caused all sorts of awful things to happen. The worst of which being that the young Rito were unable to approach Valu, which meant they were unable to receive their scales they needed to grow their wings. Link also met Komali, the chieftain's son. Komali was having a crisis of identity. His grandmother had recently passed away and she was very close to Komali. As a result, Komali lost all confidence in himself and spent his time grieving in his room, refusing to be cheered up by anyone. Unfortunately for Link, it was Komali who possessed one of the Goddess Pearls, his last possession given to him by his grandmother. Link then meets Medli, who, unbeknownst to him, would be the Rito to have the biggest impact on his life. Medli was the disciple of Komali's grandmother, who held the title Valu's Assistant, a prestigious and important role. As a result, Medli spent a great amount of time with Komali, and had a sort of motherly affection towards him, constantly worrying and doting over him. Realizing they wanted the same goal, Medli and Link schemed to help Komali and the Rito by helping Medli reach the caverns leading to Valu. Shortly after entering the caverns, however, Medli was captured by moblins. Link ventured forth to save her and end the troubles of the Rito once and for all. Link ventured deep into the caves and freed Medli, before finding out that Valu was being harassed by Goma, placed in the cavern by Ganondorf to endlessly attack the dragon's tail. The pain brought Valu endless misery, which caused him to lash out in anger. Defeating Goma in short order brought immediate relief to Valu, thus saving the Rito way of life. This also served as sufficient motivation for Komali, who felt inspired by Link's bravery. Having regained his confidence somewhat, he imparted the pearl to Link as a thank you. The rest of Link's questing for the Master Sword went relatively Rito-free, save for Quill helping Link find Jabun, and occasionally having delivered him mail, or perhaps Link having discovered the annual Birdman contest. With the legendary blade in his possession, Link once again assaults Forsaken Fortress, and although he slew the Helmarok King, he was once again effortlessly defeated by Ganondorf. Before Ganondorf was able to cause further harm to Link and Tetra, however, the Rito saved the day yet again, this time with the assistance of Valu. While the dragon kept Ganondorf busy, Quill and a newly airborne Komali dove in to save Link and Tetra. Having returned to Hyrule, Link learned that the Master Sword was severely weakened, and to power up the sword, he had to reawaken the Wind and Earth sages by finding their descendants. Link then went on to meet the spirit of Laruto, the deceased Zora who was once the Sage of the Earth. She reveals that the descendant carries a special harp. It's Medli who's meant to be the next spirit of the Earth. Link travels back to Medli and awakens the knowledge within her by playing Earth God's lyric. Now aware of her duties, Link and Medli proceed to the Earth Temple. Defeating the evil inside the Earth Temple and playing the song alongside Medli resumed the prayer, and partially powered up the Master Sword. Medli remained in the Earth Temple, asking Link to watch over Komali as she prepares for her task. After reawakening the Wind Sage and reconstructing the Triforce of Courage, Link went to Ganondorf yet again with Tetra at his side, this time defeating him with a blow to the head. Hyrule is buried under waves once again, and the Hero of Wind experienced his last run-in with the Rito on record, as Aryll, Tetra's crew, and Medli arrive to rescue them. As they are returned to safety, they're greeted by Komali. The Rito don't really appear again in the adult timeline. Presumably they would have at some point become aware of New Hyrule, but what becomes of them we do not know. As mentioned, the Decline Timeline Zora seem to be little more than mindless monsters, and with no major flooding there doesn't really seem to be a need for the Rito. The Child Timeline has a proper Zoran kingdom in Twilight Princess, and seemingly no large Rito kingdom, at least in Hyrule. But interestingly, some small proof of the existence of the Rito can be found. In Castle Town, specifically in Twilight Princess HD, murals on the wall can be seen showing the Rito people alongside a child Link. What this means for the existence of the Rito is up for debate. If you want a fantastic breakdown of the panels themselves, take a look at Zeltik's video, link in the description. With the 3 timelines complete, that brings us to the next game with a major appearance from the Rito, that being the most recent game to come out and the most recent game in the timeline, Breath of the Wild. As we know, Breath of the Wild actually exists at the end of every timeline, being the natural result of any series of events. While my guess is that this is likely to change at some point in the future, for now it's what we have to work with. In the centuries between Breath of the Wild and any other game, the Rito have changed quite drastically. No longer Hylian-looking humanoids with a beak who use dragon scales to fly, they are now fully feathered avian people who effortlessly dominate the skies. They've propagated well enough to have a civilization of their own, centralized in Rito Village, found in the middle of Lake Totori, part of the Tabantha frontier. Here they live under the watchful eye of Chief Kennelly, living a relatively peaceful life. Unfortunately for the Rito and all other peaceful races of Hyrule, Calamity Ganon happened. All major races across Hyrule united to stop him, hoping to utilize the many guardians built by the Sheikah, as well as the 4 mighty divine beasts to defeat Calamity Ganon and his minions. Each race put forth a champion to contribute to the cause. The Hylian champion was to wield the Master Sword, and the other 4 were to ride the divine beasts. Naturally, the Rito were of the 4 races present, and they submitted the brash but talented young Rito Revali as their champion, to pilot the bird-like divine beast Va Meadow. Initially friendly with Link, the Hylian champion's cold demeanor offended Revali, and as a result he chose Link to be his rival. The two would have many antagonistic encounters, though it is obvious that under it all, Revali had a respect for Link. The day came when Ganon attacked and corrupted the Guardians as well as the divine beasts. Revali desperately fought for his life against Windblight Ganon for control of Va Meadow, but was ultimately slain in battle, forsaking control of the divine beast to Ganon permanently and having his soul trapped in the beast for 100 years, while the defeated hero slept. After Link is awakened 100 years later, he endeavors to defeat the blights within each divine beast and free the soul of the champion trapped within. He eventually finds himself in Rito Village, learning that a rampaging Va Meadow is making the Rito unable to fly far from their home, as Va Meadow attacks them when they get too close. Link meets another promising Rito warrior named Teba, who's currently trying his best to live up to the standard that Revali set. He's preparing to attack Va Meadow on his own, but considers Link's offer of assistance. After testing Link's skills with archery, the two launch an assault on Va Meadow together. They succeed in destroying the divine beast's defenses, and Teba drops Link into position to assault the beast. Link succeeds where Revali failed and defeats Windblight Ganon, freeing Revali's soul from the beast and causing Va Meadow to become docile again, putting an end to the Rito's trouble. Revali's spirit admits a begrudging respect for Link and then resumes control of Va Meadow, steering him to the top of Rito Village. When the time comes for Link to assault Ganon, Revali finally fulfills his destiny as a champion and attacks Hyrule Castle with Va Meadow, working in conjunction with the other champions to greatly wound Ganon prior to Link's face down with him. Ganon is defeated and Hyrule is saved, and Revali, presumably, has finally earned rest. The other notable Rito we meet in Breath of the Wild is Kass, the traveling minstrel who Link meets many times on his journey. His accordion can be heard from a great distance, always playing songs passed down to him related to the region you find him in. These are no ordinary songs though, and their lyrics contain clues to activating a nearby shrine. As Link solves the riddles and clears the shrines, Kass will often mention his former master. When all of the Kass-related shrines are done and Kass's traveling is over, he can be found at Rito Village with his wife and kids. Here he reveals to Link that his master was a poet from Kakariko Village, the court poet of the royal family in fact, who was rather infatuated with Princess Zelda. Playing one final touching song, Kass reveals that Princess Zelda was in love with Link, and that Link's sacrifice protecting her is what finally allowed her powers to activate. Kass's master dedicated his life to learning the songs of the hero from ages past, so he can pass them along to the champion when he's resurrected, which is done through Kass. It's a beautiful story, and Kass is a much beloved character for good reason, and he's also a great note to end the timeline on. I personally love the Rito, I have since Wind Waker, and I hope their appearance in Breath of the Wild means we'll see them a little bit more frequently in future games, maybe with a frequency closer to the other major races like the Goron and the Zora. I think we can rest assured that at the very least, they're gonna appear in Breath of the Wild too. So right off the bat, we're going to address the Va Ruta in the room. We have two appearances of Rito, and they seem wildly different. One might be tempted to make the argument that they may not be related at all. This argument is strengthened by the fact that Breath of the Wild takes place at the end of every timeline. So if we follow, for example, the Decline timeline through to Breath of the Wild, how did the Rito appear in Breath of the Wild if there were no Rito in the Decline timeline to transform from, unless they're totally different? Not only that, but how can the Rito have evolved from Zora if there are already a tribe of Zora? Well, I'm going to argue that despite all that, they are related, and it will get argued in small chunks over the next few sections. Proof of evolutionary similarities will be argued in the physical section, similarity in behavioral patterns will be argued in the behavior section, and other connections will be argued in the theory section. I'm breaking up this theory because I think it would be messy to restate so much from the other sections in the theory section, instead of peppering bits of the argument throughout. The earliest Rito look essentially human, with bird-like features. The men seem to have darker skin and stand much taller, while the women seem to be shorter and lighter skinned. Their hair is predominantly white, although this is not always the case, but their hair is always in wild, sharp styles that reminisce the tips of feathers or the tails of birds. Braids and ponytails are seemingly common among both men and women. In place of a nose, they have a large yellow beak, but it seems to only function for breathing, as they still have regular mouths like a Hylian, which they use to talk. They have yellow talons for legs as well. They also dress in very traditional tribal clothing that almost seems Gaelic in design. The wings of these first Rito have a bit of variance. Some Rito have visible wings on their forearms that are used to fly, and others don't have visible wings, yet have their entire arms turned into them when flying. Possibly their wings have yet to fully develop phenotypically, but are still usable through Valu's magic. Turning now to the new Rito. By this point in the Zelda timeline, centuries in the future, the Rito have completely avian forms, with only vaguely humanoid body structure relating them to Hylians. Their entire body is covered in feathers. Importantly, however, these feathers are very thick, insulating feathers, bringing the Rito enough warmth to survive cold climates relatively easy. Their arms are natural wings, as opposed to having the wings attached. Instead, the wings themselves seem to function as arms, being bendable in the same way, and having fingers at the end. Also, the Rito themselves have much more variation, with the chief looking like an owl and Kass looking like a parrot. Their feet have sprouted into proper talons, and they've grown a full beak from which they now talk and breathe. The Wind Waker Rito have physical ties to both the Zora that they evolved from and the Breath of the Wild Rito they'll eventually become, starting first with the connection with the Zora. The first obvious connection is that both races seem to be quite tall. Both have humanoid bodies but have extremities that differ from a Hylian, such as webbed feet and talons. The beak grows at the same sharp angle as the long noses of the Zora. Most strikingly, however, concept art of the Ocarina of Time Zora, their closest ancestors, show us that the Zora have fins protruding from the exact same place as the Rito have their wings, showing that biologically at least, the Rito body and the Zoran body are genetically predisposed to grow extremities at the same locations. Now for similarities tying together the two groups of Rito. Firstly, they still seem to have an affection for braids, and many hairstyles are similar to that of the original Rito. In fact, most newer Ritos seem to still have elements of white in their hair, even if their base color is different. Also, although fully formed, their beaks do share some similarities to that of the original Rito. Also, their clothes still have a very Gaelic style to them, and although less clothes are worn in general, they do bear a strong similarity to that of the original Rito. Like before, we'll describe the behavior of the original Rito, relate them to the Zora, move on to the new Rito, and then relate the two groups. The original Rito dwelled on Dragon Roost Island, specifically in the Rito Eri. They were an evolution of the Zora, having fled up the mountain to avoid the rising tide. Why the Zora couldn't simply have swam in the Great Sea is a question better left for a video about the Zora. All that we are concerned with is the fact that they did. They live in a civilized tribal setting with a single chieftain that leads the tribe of his own volition. He receives advice from advisors but makes the final decisions. The line of succession seems to be patrilineal, with the chieftain's son training from a young age to rule after his father gives up power. The Great Sea Rito don't seem to do much in the way of trade or commerce, and they don't seem to be industrious or agricultural. Instead, they make their way in the world through the use of their unique talent, and serve as mailmen and delivery men for the Great Sea. With a mail office in the Eri, they sort and deliver the mail of the entire Great Sea. This seemingly makes them enough currency to support their tribe and then have some excess rupee, as they have money to throw around, such as paying part-timers and sponsoring the yearly Birdman contest. Before having access to wings, the Rito got around through the use of grappling hooks, and their posts can be found all across the Great Sea. After Valu arrived, the dragon and the Rito formed a symbiotic relationship, with Valu protecting the Rito and granting them scales, which imbued them with flight. In return, the Rito did everything they could to look after the needs of Valu. From this relationship, a very important cultural role was formed, that of the attendant. It seems that, much like the Sith, there is always one master and one apprentice. It's unknown if the attendant job can be willingly given up, or if it's the chosen's burden until death. Komali's grandmother is the only experienced attendant we learn about, and she leaves the role through death. The responsibility of the attendant is to look after Valu's needs and entertain him. This means the role has two major responsibilities. Possibly the most important role is the learning of Old Hylian script. Valu doesn't speak modern Hylian, and for Valu to be able to communicate with the Rito, the attendant needs to learn to speak his language. This is likely taught through texts and notes, as Medli continues her studies even after her teacher passes away, which means she's likely learning through the use of books and documents. The second job, entertaining him, is done through the learning of old, powerful music, which soothes and excites Valu, thus keeping him content. Once they reach a certain age of their youth, a Rito is tasked with climbing up Dragon Roost to receive their scale from Valu. During peacetime, this is usually a ceremonious and peaceful journey, with numerous places to take a break and plenty of cultural artwork to lead the way. The only real danger are the bomb flowers growing all over the place. A successful journey to the top sees the Rito receive their scale and their wings begin to grow. The speed at which the wings grow and the Rito master them seems to vary between individuals. For example, Komali has his wings for a very short period of time and seems in complete control of them, whereas Medli has had her wings for a while, since even before Komali received his scale, yet needs assistance with her flight. Religiously, the Great Sea Rito seem to be polytheistic. Valu is the living deity to which they primarily worship, yet they also worship the wind god, saying a prayer to its altar before departing on a flight. Lastly, they seem to have a connection to Nehru as they adorn her symbol. Whether this is in direct worship of Nehru or simply a remnant of their Zoran past is up for debate. Moving on from the Great Sea Rito, we have the Rito from Breath of the Wild. These Rito live in the aptly named Rito village above Lake Totori. Under their own chief, they have a prosperous and well-traveled existence in Hyrule, being found all across the land. As they are born with wings and feathers, flight ceases to be a cultural event and is simply a way of life. The Hyrulean Rito seem to be far more diverse in their businesses. Evidence of agriculture and trade can be found, Rito down feathers in particular being popular in mattresses and on clothing. The dangers of this version of Hyrule naturally reflect in the Rito as well, as they are far more militaristic than their predecessors, with trained soldiers and Rito-made weapons being part of the culture. They also idolize the discipline and ideology of the military, which can be seen in the existence of the Rito warrior social role. It isn't confirmed whether this is an inherited title that only one person can possess, or if we simply only have ever met one Rito warrior at a time, but this position seems to serve a lot of roles, from leading actual battles to acting as a sort of figurehead for the community and as a role model for the male youth of the village. It's also worth noting that the Rito military seems to be a male-dominated affair, with women being dissuaded from fighting. As only makes sense with their ability of flight, Rito make natural archers, and aerial combat is something that the Rito spend a lot of time practicing, for practical reasons as well as for entertainment. Now that the behavior of the two groups are defined separately, it would be helpful to tie them together to help further the theory that they are the same lineage. The first thing to point out is their nearly identical societal structure. Both groups live in a patrilineal tribe led by a single chieftain. Both groups live under the shadow of a protective creature with which they have a single designated person to interact with. Both groups go through much suffering because of some threat to that protective creature. And lastly, both are musical. Music is integral to the way of life of the Rito of the Great Sea, and although it is less important to the Rito of Hyrule, they still seem to have a natural affinity to it. So for this section, we're going to address a few things. First, I will finish off my argument that the Rito in Breath of the Wild are the descendants of the Rito from the Wind Waker. Then we'll take a look at a few alternative possibilities, namely whether they're the descendants of another creature such as the Loftwing, or if the two groups of Rito are just wholly different races. Finally, we'll pay small notice to the connection between the Zora and the Rito. So we've made biological and behavioral connections between the original and new Rito. There's only one more connection to be made as well, however it is a strong one. The strongest connection between the Rito of Hyrule and the Rito of the Great Sea is that of Va Meadow. The divine beasts are all named after an important figure in the history of that respective race, and the Rito chose Medli, attendant of the ancient Rito. The fact that they chose to name their beast after her draws a direct line between the two people. I can foresee the argument being made that the names of the divine beasts are just like fan service, so the Rito being named after Medli is meaningless. After all, there's a lot of stuff in Breath of the Wild that's named after things from old games. Yet this argument is just as easily dismissed. Both Nabooru and Princess Ruto have divine beasts named after them, and both are directly mentioned in the game, with Urbosa reminiscing about Nabooru and Princess Ruto being mentioned in the Zora stone monuments. This essentially confirms that the names are not fan service, but instead specifically chosen to reflect an important person in that race's history, which means Medli is the important person in the history of the Rito that they chose to entitle their beast after. I honestly don't understand why the idea of the Breath of the Wild Rito being descendants of the Great Sea Rito is such a controversial one. Yeah, they look completely different, but so did the Rito and the Zora. If the fish-like Zora can turn into Hylian and bird-like Rito, why can't the already bird-like Rito in Wind Waker turn into the actual bird-like people we see in Breath of the Wild? Honestly, the storyline of Breath of the Wild alone spans tens of thousands of years. I'm sure there was a significant difference in how the Rito looked just in the beginning of that game alone. Moving on to other possible progenitors of the Breath of the Wild Rito, here we have two culprits who are mentioned frequently, that being the Loftwings of Skyloft and the Foka. I'm going to touch on the Foka first. Honestly, it baffles me that this is considered more likely than the Great Sea Rito. The Foka are pretty explicitly stated to be bred from birds by the king himself for the purpose of guarding temples, as opposed to having their own society. But more importantly, they aren't capable of flight whatsoever. They're completely grounded birds. It's just hard to imagine the lack of feathers makes the Wind Waker Rito so hard to believe, but a complete lack of wings is something that can be explained. On top of that, there's just no actual proof that the Foka have anything to do with the Rito. Even if you don't like my arguments for the Great Sea Rito, at least there is some proof. Next we have the Loftwings. Honestly, I don't think much of this theory either, but it has an actual argument to be made. First, we know the Loftwings are actually known in Breath of the Wild. There's a strong argument to be made that the Forgotten Temple is actually the Sealed Temple, and inside the Forgotten Temple, carvings of Loftwings can be found. See this excellent video by Zeltik for that theory. For a literally symbolic connection between the Loftwing and the Rito, I'll turn your attention to a very thorough Reddit post by user DTKirvee. Essentially, he argues that the fact that the Rito no longer use the sapphire symbol means they aren't related to the Great Sea Rito, and instead, the Rito symbol is a sort of descendant of the Hyrule crest. And as the Hyrule crest contains a Loftwing, this crest is representative of their descent from the Loftwings. Other connections include the coloring of the Rito being similar to that of the Loftwings, and as well as physical similarities such as shown here. I disagree strongly with these assertions. The symbol matching the Hylian crest seems like a stretch to me, the main reason being that the Loftwing is still part of the crest of Hyrule in Breath of the Wild. The Loftwing still have a very strong presence in Hyrule in the times of Breath of the Wild. The Rito would likely just use either the symbol from the Loftwing carvings or the symbol from the shield, as opposed to a convoluted transformation of the royal crest. After all, this is a world where people know their history going back tens of thousands of years. As for biological similarities, there are just as many differences as there are similarities. For example, the Loftwing has the beak of a shoebill, yet not a single Rito in Breath of the Wild has a shoebill style of beak. There's a strong argument to be made that the two groups of Rito are just wholly different races. I obviously disagree with this, but I find it much more likely than the Loftwing theory, and definitely more likely than the Foka. The answer for why we never met the Rito in the Child or Decline timeline can easily be chalked up to they lived somewhere outside Hyrule. And there is even some amount of proof that these Rito existed separate from the Great Sea Rito, that being the Twilight Princess mural spoken of earlier. Like I said, I find this theory to be the next most likely one, but I simply believe a connection between the two groups because there's much more proof. The only real bit of proof for this is the tablet, and honestly, that can be taken to argue for the existence of a connection as well. I mean, take a closer look. To me, their body looks very much like the Rito of Breath of the Wild, but their head looks exactly like that of the Great Sea Rito. To me, this looks like a Rito that are halfway evolved from one group to another, a Rito in transition. And capping this thick theory section off is paying homage to the connection between the Zora and the Rito. This isn't a theory anymore, it's absolutely confirmed. It's been confirmed by the Hyrule Historia, by the Encyclopedia, and even by Aonuma himself. But for a long time, fan sites were battlegrounds for people to argue about whether the Rito actually were evolved Zora. Proof like Laruto's bloodline statement and Medli's Zora sapphire symbol were raised and disputed for a long time. This topic was one of the most debated, right up there with timeline discussions and arguing over whether Sheik was actually a man when Zelda transformed into him. So while there's little left to discuss, this theory deserves to have respect paid for being such a fundamental and well-discussed theory. The Rito appear in Hyrule Warriors in the form of Medli, who's a playable character wielding her Rito harp. The Rito are also repeat offenders in the Smash Bros. Series. Well, I should say that Medli is a repeat offender, appearing as a trophy in Brawl and Wii U, as well as a sticker in Brawl and a spirit in Ultimate. Revali also appears as a spirit, so the new Rito aren't wholly underrepresented. Interestingly, AJ Aonuma sat down for a roundtable discussion with the two mangaka behind the Ocarina of Time manga, A. Honda and S. Nagano. During this, he mentions that the Rito were actually inspired by the Watarara race created for the manga, saying the following: "In Ocarina of Time, as in most Zelda, we have created a large number of tribes, like the Goron who live in the mountains, or the Zoras, people from the water. For the Wind Waker, when we chose to situate the action in the middle of the ocean, we immediately felt that need to create a race that can move through the air. During long trips offshore, we needed faster characters capable of transmitting information to Link. It was at this moment that I remembered the Watarara clan you had invented for the adaptation of Ocarina of Time. In short, I digress a bit about the initials, but we were inspired by your work to give birth to the Rito race, creatures that are half man, half bird that can move very quickly with their wings." Whether or not the Rito from Breath of the Wild and Wind Waker are the same, they show that the same concept can be expressed in wildly different ways, and I like that a lot. Much like the difference between the elegant civilized Zora and the monstrous river Zora, it's very interesting to see the same race manifest in different ways, and I hope Nintendo continues this trend of exploring different races. I have a fondness for the Rito, particularly Medli, and I look forward to talking about her in the future. Thanks for watching this episode of Hyrule History, and as always, be careful out there. It's dangerous to go alone.